Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for having this hearing. This is extremely important, as you know, and as I want the panelists to know, who I also appreciate being here. I represent Southeast Georgia. I represent the entire coast of Georgia and almost half of the Georgia-Florida state line. The West Mims fire was in my district, Mr. Carl, so this is something I'm very familiar with. Help me to understand, not all forest fires are the same, especially in the swamp, because as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the peat catches on fire and it's underneath, and when you put water on it, you can't necessarily put it out because the water table has to rise enough to get it out underneath, so it smolders for a longer time. Is that right?
Yeah, in all the way to North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Minnesota, Michigan, you have peat, or what we call muck fires, Pocosin fires, and those are organic soils that are burning. And in the swamp in your district, that West Mims fire was Okefenokee Swamp. We've tried for 30 years to suppress fires, and then we figured out going into the swamp is just throwing money away. And both the federal government and the state government actually figured that out. And what we've done is put what's called a swamp's edge break around that 600,000 acre, essentially wilderness, managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. The one thing that I think is a shining star there that can be looked at all across the country is we have what's called the Greater Okefenokee Association of Landowners. That's state agencies, right. Georgia and Florida, that's federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Forest Service. But the key is that's all the private timber companies around there as well. And they all in this together, fighting fire and dealing with this situation that really expands that partnerships, and in most cases works very well. We struggled this year with it, and we're coming back and looking at how do we improve on it. But that organization is ideal organizations to implement in the West too, where you bring everybody together and everybody has a voice.
Now, you just mentioned something I wanted to ask you about. As I understand it, the West Mims fire was started by lightning. It started in the Okefenokee National Forest, and we didn't do the federal government didn't do anything until it started to get to the edges where it would impact the private landowners. They said they wanted it to burn. Is that the policy?
It isn't always that they want it to burn, but it is good for the swamp to burn. But backing, and that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, backing them is that we have, since the 80s, tried to go in and put those fires out in the swamp. You can't get people and equipment in there, so you're mostly dropping it with expensive air operations, and you can't put the fire out in that peat with that. So essentially, when those fires start out there, we prepare on the outside, almost like a prescribed burn. We start to build our lines and begin the suppression effort around the swamp, rather than go in and try to fight it, knowing that we can't put it out in that swamp.
All right, well, two things real quickly. First of all, you said earlier that the states have the plans for preventative burning and everything, and they're approved by the EPA. What about in the national forest like the Okefenokee? Is that still done by the state of Georgia, or is that done by EPA itself, or who?
Well, each state is different, but for example, in Florida, because we implement the Clean Air Act for our Department of Environmental Protection with EPA, the National Forest and all the federal agencies come to us for an authorization to burn. So we oversee that program even for the federal agencies as well. And that is a little bit different in each state. Georgia does the same thing. So the Fish and Wildlife, if they've got to get a prescribed burn, they go to the state of Georgia.
Do they ever do a prescribed burn in the Okefenokee?
They do on the edges, in the uplands on the edges.
But never, I mean, it's such an enormous area.
And I believe they do some. Again, most of the Okefenokee is in Georgia, so I don't watch it on a day-to-day basis. But what they try to be careful of is they don't put it into areas where they know that it may with weather changes, continue to burn until it becomes a catastrophe.
Well, as you know, Georgia's the #1 forestry state in the nation. I mean, this is extremely important to our state, especially to my district. I don't know if this will make you feel any better, and it probably won't, but this is not an uncommon problem that we're dealing with, in that getting funding for preventative measures almost across the board is difficult a lot of times. You know, and I'm a healthcare expert, and it's difficult to convince Congress sometimes, if we will just put money toward this, it'll save us so much down the line. Same thing with the preventative burning and all the things that we can do in forestry. In all fairness to members of Congress, you know, we're just trying to put out fires, so to speak, with our budget.
Okay,
So it's
time's
difficult.
expired.
I just wanted to make sure I got that in, Mr. Chairman, and I yield.
Jenna's time's expired.